We have a little ice cream, and be sure to come and get some and take it all away because I don't want to take it home. So what do we got? So do we have announcements tonight?
Yeah, I wanted to share that we're doing the in-person classes starting August 13th.
I don't know if people can hear you. Do you want to come up here?
Up there. I can give everybody just a little preview.
So Angel's going to tell us about some Saturday classes that are starting. There she is.
So, hello, everyone out there.
No.
There. So yeah, so we're trying
No, I
something
can't.
new this year to give people a chance to
Can't
kind of get out into the teaching gardens here at Zilker. And
No.
we're doing 3 classes to teach you different
Maybe.
things once a month.
Well, mine says mute also.
Carrie, can you mute? Yeah. So the first one will be on the 13th of August, and it will be a planning
Okay.
the fall garden class. And we'll be doing
Well,
everything from, just
talking.
the sort of 101 of organic gardening, learning about all the elements, to also learning how to start
Show
seeds
something.
indoors. So we'll be bringing some soil and seeds for everyone to kind of take home some seeds
I don't
and
know
start indoors. And
how to get the sound up.
yeah, so that'll be the first one. And I'll have that in the newsletter. So if you aren't signed up for the newsletter, be sure to do
Oh,
that
yeah.
with everything that's going on. And then, Carrie, I'm going to mute you. Okay, so then in September, there will be a mushroom gardening class. So that one will also be kind of in the garden, just in time for fall mushroom gardening. So that's the topic of the September talk. And then in October, Tim will be doing a talk on fall tomato growing. So he's going to bring a little bit of that knowledge. And then in November, we're going to learn how to lacto ferment. So we'll be making kimchi with everybody. So join us for that class. And then December, we'll be talking about protecting your plants from like frost, even like pest type things. So yeah, so keep an eye out for those.
Mute by audio.
And it does require registration since it's in person, and we have to have supplies for everybody. We want to make sure that we know how many people are coming. So it's also membership days, which means if you're a member of the Zilker Botanical Garden, admission into the park is free every Saturday, second Saturday. So you don't have to pay admission. And I believe their annual membership is $50 to the Conservancy. So if you join the
keys up at the top there.
Carrie, I keep having to mute you. Don't touch any buttons. So yeah, so if you aren't yet a member, it's a great idea to support the Conservancy. And then you'll be able to join our classes for free on the second Saturdays. And the only one we won't have on the second Saturday because of ACL and the park or the gardens will be closed is Tim's talk. It'll be the first day of October, which ACL won't be happening yet. So yeah, that's it from me.
Do we have any other announcements?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I've got the seaweed sale here. $8.
Russell's selling seaweed for $8.
You're making into liquid seaweed. Just get like over here.
It's brown. It's brown.
It's brown. It's powdery.
It's like salmon, haven't seen.
So if you want some, see Russell. He's got it available for $8.
Oh, concentrate.
A concentrate, yeah.
Okay, but you don't have to mix it up all at once.
Yeah. Anyone else have an announcement? Tim?
Yes, this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock at the Natural Gardener, I'm giving a talk on water conservation.
Oh, perfect. Good timing because of the, drought. Anyone else have announcement? All right. So I'm going to talk a little about earth kind landscaping, efficient use of water in the garden and landscape. So I just wanted to touch base a little bit on a few things, and I'm going to pass this around, and people can kind of look to see if there's something in there they might need for, because there's a lot of information in here. So efficient and responsible water use. So that's really the question right now when we're having a drought. And I see lots of posts online about how many times a day are you watering? I'm like, well, if you're watering every day, that's probably too much. So I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit so that people can have a better idea about how to use water to keep their plants alive in this drought. So there's a danger of exhausting valuable aquifers by excessively using water, and also the threat of polluting groundwater with industrial, agricultural, and home landscape contaminants. Nitrates from excessive and untimely fertilization are especially threatening. So that falls us to us gardeners to use fertilizers responsibly so that we're not polluting the groundwater. And yeah. So a little bit about the plant soil water cycle. When water is applied to the soil, it seeps down through the root zone very gradually. Each layer of soil must be filled to field capacity before water descends to the next layer. This water movement is referred to as the wetting front. Water moves downward through sandy soil much faster than through fine textured soil such as clay or silt. If only 1/2 the amount of water required for healthy growth of your landscape or garden is applied at a given time, it only penetrates the top half of the root zone, and the area below the point where the wetting front stops remains dry, as if no irrigation has been applied at all. Once enough water is applied to move the wetting front into the root zone, moisture is absorbed by plant roots and moves up through the stem to the leaves and the fruit. Leaves have thousands of microscopic openings called stomates, through which water vapor is lost from the plant. This continual loss of water is called transpiration and causes the plant to wilt unless a constant supply of soil water is provided by absorption through the roots. So this article has some stuff about water quality. If you want to look to see what your water quality is from your well, it has a lot of details about that. So water techniques. Proper watering methods are seldom practiced by most gardeners. They either under or overwater when irrigating. So mulch is a layer of material covering the soil surface around plants. This covering befriends plants in a number of ways. It moderates soil temperature and thus promoting great root development. Roots prefer to be cool in summer and warm in winter. This is possible under a year-round blanket of mulch. Mulch conserves moisture by reducing evaporation of water vapor from the soil surface and reduces water requirements. It's important. So any plant material that is free of weed seed and not disease is suitable for mulch. Weed-free hay or straw leaves and grass clippings and compost are all great. Fresh grass clippings are fine for use around well-established plants, but cure them for a week or so before planting them around young seedlings. Mulch vegetable and flower gardens the same way. So irrigating methods. 4 distinct methods of irrigating are sprinkling, flooding, furrow irrigation, and drip irrigation. Consider the equipment and technique involved in each method before selecting the right system. So it goes into great detail about flooding, furrowing, etc. And I think most of us use hoses. I'll read the hose part. So hose-in sprinkling. Sprinkler irrigation or hose-in overhead sprinkling, as it's sometimes called, is the most popular and most common watering method. Sprinkler units can be set up and moved about quickly and easily, and they are inexpensive to buy. But if used incorrectly, they can be extremely wasteful of water. Sprinkler equipment varies, et cetera, in cost. Right, so this is on. All right, so vegetable gardens. Generally speaking, if you keep your tomatoes happy, the rest of your vegetable will receive enough water. Obviously, irrigating a garden containing many kinds of vegetables is not simple. Early in the season, when plants are young and have small root systems, they remove water from the soil near the center of the row. As the plants grow larger, roots penetrate into more soil volume and withdraw greater quantities of water faster. Yeah. All right. So if you want to read about the drip irrigation in here and you're doing that, it gives great details about how long to run your hose. Water is a limited and fragile resource. Each gardener utilizes a small part of the total water consumed, but the total use by all gardeners is significant. Irrigating home gardens and landscape is considered a luxury use of water by many people. Non-essential use of water implies a special responsibility on the part of the gardeners to efficiently use the resource and protect its quality. So I'm going to hand this out. You guys can look at it. Over here.
Right. Thanks for that, Mary.
I don't know. I just think it was-
Thank you for that. So we are so happy to have Kara Kroeger here with us tonight. And thanks everybody for coming out in person, beating the heat, getting in their hot cars, making it over here. You know, as organic gardeners, we know soil is the most important part of the organic process. And I was fortunate to see Kara speak at the TOFGA, the Texas Organic Gardeners and Farmers Conference this past winter. And I saw this presentation and thought it would be great for us as gardeners too, because it all applies. Soil is super important, and it's a great way to, without a lot of technology or cost, to be able to really kind of understand your soil a little bit better. So please give Kara a warm welcome, everyone.
Howdy, everybody. Get this thing hooked on here. Can y'all hear it with it there?
Yeah.
Is that okay? All right. I'm going to share my screen. Work for me. Awesome. All right. Hello, everybody on Zoom, and hello, everybody in person. So it's good to be here. My name is Kara Kroeger, and I am a regenerative ranching consultancy manager and also just a natural regenerative agriculturalist. I come from a background in holistic health. So I started out as an herbalist to begin with, and then a nutritionist, and then a chef. And then I went back to school at 37 and got my degree in agriculture because I started living on a ranch in Uvalde at one point and started learning about pasture restoration and learning how to improve soil health in the pasture in order to increase forage for the livestock that we were growing there. And it was just huge lights went off. All of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, here we have the gut, the GI tract, which has all these enzymes and all these microbes and all these things that are like pulling nutrients and making them more available and then making them available to our body. And I started looking at the soil and I was like, this is the same exact thing. And this is so cool. And people who farm are way cooler than working with people in doctors' offices. So I was like, I'm going back to school and getting my degree in agriculture. And so, and I really enjoyed the people that I worked with in the doctor's offices as well, but it's just a lot more fun to be outside with people who are being very inventive with nature. And so I wound up working for NCAT, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, for many years, for about, well, not many, but about 4 years. And then just recently got hired by Grassroots Carbon, which is a carbon market that sells soil carbon storage by livestock producers to buyers who want to offset their carbon footprint. So ultimately, I work with the producers who are coming into that market to help them improve their grazing practices so that they can store more carbon in the soil and in turn decrease climate issues, provide ecosystem services. Right now we focus on carbon only, but we're hoping to stack credits here soon and start doing biodiversity credits and water credits and different things like that. And it's very complex. It's a very, very, very complex market and thing to be a part of. It's right at the forefront of it all. So it's really interesting and totally wild, but it's exciting to be there. So ultimately, I have learned over the years that soil is everything, right? It basically is what makes our food nutritious. It's what allows water to be absorbed into the ground. It's what allows everything to occur in terms of the air in which we breathe, right? We would not be able to live without soil, because without soil, we literally can't breathe, because without soil, there's no plants. And without plants, there's no oxygen in the environment. And without plants, there's also a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and we won't be able to live in that environment, right? So ultimately, soil's everything. So I like to start out with a quote that says, despite mankind's lofty aspirations and many notable achievements, our survival depends on a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And that's it. So how about that? What do y'all think about that? That's pretty crazy, right? So all of us, a lot of times we all too often are just managing what's above ground, right? We're looking at how the plant's growing, and we're looking at whether, it's got spots on it, maybe from mildew or this or that, and then we're going to spray the plant for some fungus, or we're going to try to increase, decrease the aphids or things like that, right? We're oftentimes looking at the plant above ground, but we're not thinking about what's going on below ground. And this is really unfortunate, because basically that's where all the magic happens, right? Within the soil is where all of those different transactions are taking place that make a plant healthy. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a forage environment or whether you're growing a garden or whether you're farming. Ultimately, you've got to have good soil health. And so one of the things that's really important to note is that we're all dealing with a lot of compacted soils in this country and across the world, really, because we haven't taken care of soil health. So there's just a lot of compaction going on. And it's very hard to make nutrient cycle and water cycle and air cycle when we're dealing with compaction, right? So how can we improve that? And that's a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. Is I'm going to show you what to look for, but I'm also going to give you some tidbits as we go along the way of how to decrease that. And what I want y'all to keep in mind is that I do mostly work in pasture environments. I'm not a farmer, and I am a gardener, but it's been a while since I've had a garden, and I love to garden, but it is not my strength. So mostly I work in pasture environments and working with more ecosystems that are kind of intact in those hopefully native plant environments, but oftentimes many invasives and annuals as well. So ultimately, that's just my little disclaimer to begin with. But one of the things to take note of is that when we do mess up our soil, it can take a really long time to repair it, right? It can take a very, very long time. And I just want to, I'd like to get a show of hands. How many people have been to Tim's farm?
Where?
To Tim's farm?
Tim Miller's.
Yes, Tim Miller, Millburg Farm. Okay, so a few people here. I mean, Tim, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but if you have not been to Tim's farm, you should go and you should really see what he's put in place in order to increase water infiltration, porosity, aggregation, decrease compaction, increase water holding capacity, increase everything that you, microbiology, especially fungal dominance. You need to go to Tim's farm because he is doing it, and he's doing it without any water that is not, it's totally dry land farming, okay? So those who think that we have to have water from here and from there, you don't. You get your soil right, and Tim collects rainwater, and he pours a little tiny splash of water every day onto his plants, and those plants live and they thrive, and they're some of the best tasting plants you'll ever see. So that's just my little 2 cents. Go to Tim's farm if you want to see what I'm talking about today. You're going to see pictures, but if you want to see it working in action, there's not a lot of places where you can see it working in action in the capacity that it's working in action there. So I'm just putting that out there. So that being said, Tim, how long did it take for you to rehab your soil? I mean, I know you have been there for a long time, and I know your family's been there for a long time, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it can take a long time. If we mess up our soil, it can take a long time to get it back. So Tim, how long did it take you to kind of bring it back up to where you are now? I mean, I know you've been in a good place for a long time.
Well, we have to back that up. I mean, I think the main emphasis was no water leaves the property.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 5 acres. So I constructed 1.5 miles of trenches, like almost immediately.
Yeah.
And then dug sunken pits all over the place so that when it does rain, that water has to stay on the property.
Yeah.
But, utilizing wood chips into applications, I would say about 5 years in, I saw immediate results.
Yeah.
And then as I got more wood chips, anybody, never let that truck go down the street. You give them a 6-pack of water or beer, it's dumped in your driveway.
Keep the wood chips.
But,
Yeah.
But some of the areas, you try to do a large garden, or in this case, a farm, 5 acres is a lot to try to manage. And so it was quickly divided all up into beds and then areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so some areas got sheet composted with wood chips 3 feet deep, and just walked away from those areas and concentrated on some of the others.
Yeah.
Mind you, I was a stay-at-home dad, so I had kids that were squawking, and then the wife had to have, she comes home and she has to nurse, and it was like, great, have the kids, I'm out the door, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. So ultimately, though, it took about 5 years for you to take some degraded soil and get it back online, right?
Yes.
So it's not a quick process, right? It's a very slow process. So the quicker you can get to it, the better, is what I'm trying to say, right? So ultimately, we need soils to move air through them. We need soils to move water through them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And some of what we're going to look at is also going to tell us the type of microbiology and some of the activity that's happening by what I'll show you. We're going to be able to look at the uptake and availability of soil nutrients. What you see happen in the soil is also going to reflect the plants as well. You'll look at the two together, and I'll talk about those simultaneously as we go through this. But all of, ultimately, how your soil health is going to determine the palatability of the foods that you are producing, whether it's grass for livestock, forbs for livestock, or vegetables and fruits in your garden or orchard. And so in general, we really need to think about soil health, and we need to think about it as it's our role to be stewards of the future, right? And to create efficient and sustainable production for the long haul, because we need to be able to produce food for a very long time. And at the rate in which we're moving, we're not doing a very good job of that. We also need to work on how the soil health can improve our profit margins. So I think many of you are home gardeners, but there's still a profit margin in your home garden, accounting, right? I mean, we can spend a lot of money on a home garden. We can just do all kinds of things, but start thinking about it from a profit margin perspective, like a profit margin for what you're putting into your body, right? In comparison to what you might pay at the store. Keep a track of that. It's kind of interesting to know. And soil health can improve that profit margin. And then long-term planning for just overall, production, keeping production going on your place, especially when we hit years like this, which can be very, very challenging, right? So ultimately, that is those are all important things to consider. All right, so we've talked a little bit about why we're doing these types of things. I was supposed to switch to this slide like 5 minutes ago. So ultimately, this is me doing one of the soil health analysis at Pajarito Ranch, which is out near Stockdale, and they have a grass-fed grazing operation there. And so we were doing some visual soil assessments there to look at the productivity of their forage for their cattle. So one of the things that's very important to remember is that when we have good soil health, it can actually increase photosynthesis in plants from 30 to 60%. And this is really important. Why is this important? Can anybody tell me why we want to increase photosynthesis? Say again.
Get the plants to grow and produce.
Right? And why do the plants grow and produce when they are making when they're doing more photosynthesis?
More sugar.
More sugars, right? So as that carbon dioxide comes into the plant out of the atmosphere, it's then turned into carbon sugar exudates, right? And those exudates go down in through the plant and they go into the root system of the plant, and then they are secreted out the roots so that they feed the microbes in exchange for nutrients. And those microbes are creating enzymes that are making those nutrients, whether it's mostly it's minerals, but it's B vitamins and different things like that too. It's turning them into plant available forms, right? So it's an exchange. What else happens with those sugar exudates when it goes into the soil?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm on Zoom and your slides are not popping up for us.
Oh, thank you for sharing.
Or at least they're not on my computer.
So you can't see, can anybody see them?
I see the slides, but they're not moving forward. It just has the first page.
Okay.
So it's grassroots carbon visual soil assessment and your name, but then when I tried to add, it says follow pointer, presenter's pointer, but then it doesn't actually move. That's different now.
There you go.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to leave it in this form, I guess, so that y'all can see it. And hopefully that's not too distracting. Sometimes when you go into that full screen mode, it causes trouble. Okay, so here we are. So yes, those exudates are going down and they're storing carbon into the soil. And what that does is it sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere for a really long period of time, because a lot of times once you get carbon at certain depths into the soil, it's going to increase that carbon storage. So a really fascinating fact is that second to the oceans, soil is what stores the most carbon. Even when you combine plants and atmospheric carbon together, soil stores more carbon than both of those. So that's pretty amazing, right? We think about planting trees a lot as a carbon solution, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think that's a great solution. But because those trees are going to pull more out and store more in the soil. But ultimately, we're thinking about trees. What about our pasture environments? What about our grasslands? What about all these things that are, little solar panels just waiting for sun so that it can put carbon down into the atmosphere, down into the soil. So ultimately, this is a really interesting fact. So 343 gigatons of that carbon actually is in pasture environments. So we have a big capacity, whether it's in a pasture that we own or in a garden plot or in a farm plot to store more carbon in the soil by changing our practices a little bit.
How do lawns figure into that?
Good question. You know, lawns are going to be, they're going to store carbon. They will, but they use a lot of water, you know, ultimately. Lawns probably actually store a good amount of carbon because of how much they're being watered. But there's also not like really tall, long soil panels on those grasses, right? So the longer that you can let your lawn grow, the more solarization you will have on that leaf, and the more it's going to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So choosing grass species in your lawn that will do well without a lot of water, but also, you know, sequester carbon by way of being able to grow a little bit longer. You know, it's hard. Lawns are, it's not my specialty. So I can't really speak to it more than that, except for that, you know, we should put other plants in our yard maybe that can sequester carbon and have small little areas of grass where we can enjoy yoga in the yard on occasion, because I do like to do that. Anyway, so ultimately I like to show this picture. This is from the Betty Ford Gardens, and it's called the Secret, let's see, The Secret Life of Roots. And I love this picture because it really shows how deep these roots can get when they're in soils that will allow them to get that deep, right? So ultimately, you have the capacity to shoot roots, you know, 10, 15 feet down into the soil, create that aggregation, store water, create microbiology, and all of these things that are going to be helping us above ground and providing ecosystem services above ground. So most of these are perennial grass plants that you see in this picture, but it takes all of the plants. So perennial grasses tend to have those really fibrous, expanding roots, whereas your forbs, which are often called weeds in some scenarios, are going to have more tap roots. Some of them have fibrous roots, but many of them have tap roots. You also have your legumes there too. So you need a nice array of biodiversity in these environments, including in your home garden, right? So when you are doing your home garden, a lot of people want to till and they want to create, you know, clean space, and they want to watch the weeds and that type of thing. But ultimately, people are concerned that it steals water and that it makes for insects and different things like that. And that can be the case in some scenarios. But a lot of times you can also do those things, have all of that, and it can actually improve the system and make it stronger. So ultimately, it's important to kind of create that biodiversity even in your home garden as well. And if you haven't read The One Straw Revolution, I think that's a really good book. And just to, you know, say something that Tim does again, you know, he lets the Johnson grass grow really, really high, and all these grasses that are considered kind of invasive grasses, but he lets them grow in the way that in which he creates this mulch and everything like that. They pull out really easily. And then when it gets really hot, he just stacks them around the cages that his tomatoes are growing in and creates shade for the tomatoes. And so that they don't get as hot. And it's just, then it falls to the ground and becomes natural mulch. So these are really, really important, interesting things that we can all learn to do. We just have to get out of the mindset that everything has to be clean and it has to be, you know, a certain way. We have to start thinking very differently about how we do things. So yes, ma'am. The One Straw Revolution. And it's written by a Japanese farmer who's from Japan. And well, that was redundant, but anyway, he lives in Japan and his farm is still there. And ultimately his book is all about what he calls do nothing farming, which is definitely not do nothing farming, but the concepts are let nature do the work for you, right? So it's very interesting there. Okay. So I'm going to go over how to do a visual soil assessment. And I base this presentation off a book by a gentleman from New Zealand. His name is Graham Shepherd. And this book is really great. It has pastoral grazing and cropping in the book. So there's two different sections to it. And there's a scoring system I'm not going to go through the scoring system today. I'm just going to give you some basics on how to do a visual soil assessment using a few of the things that it teaches you in this book. But ultimately, you can have this book and you can learn about both the cropping scoring system and the pastoral scoring system. And then year after year, you can do it to see how your soils are getting better over time. So I want to ask a question here. We see two sides of the fence here. We see one side that has a lot of grasses on it, and we see the other side that has more bare ground. So which side of the fence do you think is doing more, which one has better soil health? The right, okay, right. And why is that? Right? Okay, so because the soil's covered, right? And because there's continuous living root in the ground that's feeding those soil microbes with carbon. We've also got minimal disturbance, right? So even if cattle do come through there, it's gonna only minimally disturb because you've got a lot of grass there that's protecting the soil. Or if a windstorm came through, or even if it rained 20 inches in one foul swoop, you'd still have your soil intact and in place there. There's also biodiversity in the pasture, right? So you can see a few different types of species in that pasture. And more than likely they're integrating livestock. I don't know, it doesn't look like it's been grazed recently, but anyway, I think it probably got that way because they were introducing livestock on it in a adaptively managed way. So what we can do is we could do a soil health assessment looking at both sides of the fence, right? And we could get an idea of what was going on there. But what's even more interesting would be to look underneath the fence, right? Underneath the fence line where there's absolutely no management going on whatsoever. And that's when you see the real magic. That's when you kind of see what the true potential of your soil is, right? There's been no compaction there. Nothing's been driving on it. Nothing's been treading on it. Nothing's been, manipulating it. The soil organic matter's just been doing its thing because it hasn't been disturbed. And so you can see a lot there. So when you're doing visual soil assessments, I highly recommend that you choose a number of different spots to do them. And you go and you do it, out in the middle of the pasture. And you go and you do it under the fence, and then you go and you do it in an underperforming place that you would like to see improve, but it's underperforming, right? And then you kind of get an idea of what's going on and you start comparing and looking at the different factors there. So ultimately, we are going to look at, with the visual soil assessment, we're going to look at the soil, but we're also going to be looking at the plant because we're going to be looking at the roots that are in the soil, right? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So the other thing that's wonderful about this is that it's super cheap and very easy. It can be done almost by anyone and almost anywhere, unless you have super sandy soil or hard as a rock, caliche, you can do this. And it requires very minimal training and you don't have to pay for it. You don't even need that many technical skills. And it's really, really a wonderful, wonderful thing. It kind of blew my mind. I only learned to do this about a year ago and I was like, this is insane. Why haven't we been doing this? Why don't more people do this? So it's a huge, wonderful thing to walk away with knowing how to use this. And I highly recommend that you get the book. It's available online. So I want to show you a few of the tools that we're going to use while we're doing this. So I like to use a sharpshooter, which is there on the left to dig my holes. And you can use a sharpshooter, but you can also just use a regular shovel. But something that has a bit of like a flatter blade so that you can create flat sides can be a nice thing, but it's not necessary. Also, I have a few other tools that I do along with this. So for the actual assessment, you're going to just need the shovel. You'll need a spade or a knife. This is good here because I like this one because you can kind of scrape the side. It's serrated, and that serrated side where your shovel's gone through, it will kind of create a flattening effect on the side of the hole. But with this, you can kind of get what it would be like naturally without that blade going through. So but you can also use a knife. I didn't bring a knife, but I do recommend that you have a knife too, so that you can cut down the hole just with a nice strong knife to find out where hard pans are in the soil. So yes, your spade is one good thing. And then some water is another really good thing, because sometimes if you pour water on the soil, you can see where the organic matter is better. You can see how the soil darkens in certain areas. And you can also use the water to see modeling, and modeling is going to show you if your soil's gone anaerobic as well. So that's another thing. And then a tarp so that you can lay the soil down, not on the ground, and that way you can kind of have it against something where you can see what's actually going on there. And then a camera to take lots of pictures, because you won't know what's changed unless you take pictures of it. And then this is really important, a whiteboard, right? So don't forget to do this. I know it's a pain in the butt and it's easy to become lazy and not just write down, you know, the west side of the garden on the date, you know, just do it and take it with the picture, because you will have all these pictures of soil and a year you will not remember what they are, and it's really annoying. So use your whiteboard, but you can also just get little small ones, but a whiteboard's nice because you can erase it and keep going. So those are a lot of the tools that I like to use specifically for the VSA, but there's other tools that I think are really important as well. So soil thermometers are important, and there's the kind of soil thermometer that goes just directly into the ground, and then the kind that you point down and get the soil temperature is really important, because you'll notice when you put this down into the ground, you know, you might have a soil temp of around 62 degrees at 2 inches below, right? And then if you just shine this on the ground and you do it with the plants and stuff on top, you'll get maybe, like, if it has plants on top, you'll get like 85, 89. And then if there's absolutely no plants on top and you shine it on the soil, it'll be 108, right? And so you can start looking, you can be like, okay, well, that also, I mowed that to 3 inches. And you take the temperature at 3 inches of mow, and it'll be, you know, still 105. And then you can go over here and it's like, well, I mowed that to 1 inch and it's going to be like 120, right? And so does anybody know the temperature where microbes begin to senesce and die and become inactive?
80?
No, about 130 is when they are like done. But yes, in the like upwards of the 70s and high 70s and 80s, they'll begin to, you know, not be active. But
and that's going to help with that blood flow and circulation. Mention that twice now, because that means energy in a human body.
So ultimately, it's good to have all the thermometers and look at the different levels and get to know what's going on, because as these ladies were talking about earlier with mulching and using different wood chips and things like that, they are going to help keep the temperatures of the soil down, right? And keep those microbes active for longer periods of time. Yes.
Should I ask a question now? Or later?
Yeah, you can ask one.
Okay, so in the winter this year, in the fall, we had this super drop of 80s to 30 or 40. It was like 40, 50 drop.
Yeah.
And so I noticed that probably it wiped out the microbes because the plants just stopped growing.
In the 80s?
The drop in temperature from fall to winter is really sudden. We
Okay.
didn't have the acclimation we normally have.
Okay.
And so winter plants just stop growing.
Mm.
And normally they're very, even if we don't
Mhm.
have, you know,
Mhm.
very active, but I'm wondering if the microbes were just really killed when that big drop happened.
Well, if it was a deep freeze, the microbes could have gone into senescing, but also a lack of water will increase that. But also how well your plant is producing sugars will make a big difference too. And so this tool right here is called a Brix refractometer. And this is a really good tool to use along with the visual soil assessment, because what it does is it measures sugars in your plant sap. And so you take some plant and you put it into these vice grips here. I keep going over here so people can see what I'm doing, but you put some plant material and you squeeze it and it will drip out plant sap. And you put that plant sap onto this glass plate here. That glass plate, you then put this over and you put the glass plate up to the sun and you look in and it's going to tell you the sugar content of that plant. And the higher your Brix, that means the more capacity it has to photosynthesize, to create nutrition for the plant to then send down to the roots. And it also tells you a lot about mineral content, such as calcium and other trace minerals. And it will tell you also about nitrates and, you know, boron and a lot of different nutrients in your plant. And so using this can help you understand a little bit maybe about what was going on there too. More than likely, it was a combination of things. And a lack of water, the microbes might have senesced because of freezing temperatures. And but you know, there could have been a mineral deficiency in the soil too. It just wasn't allowing things to move up and down.
Okay, say the dirt was fine and you had good dirt.
Mhm.
And you had the proper plant for the
Mhm.
proper season.
Mhm.
And the only thing that, and there was rainfall.
Mhm.
The only thing I noticed was that there was just a huge drop.
Mhm.
And I can't remember if it froze or near freezing, but it was
Yeah.
50-degree drop.
Yeah. The microbes won't senesce for that long from temperature drops. They're mostly going to senesce from a lack of water. Yeah. So even when water comes back, they're going to pretty much be proliferating again. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's hard to say. Sometimes it's just hard to say. Huh. That's interesting. Yeah. There's an infinite amount of things that could have been going on there. Nature's unbelievable in that way. So yes, you can also use a garlic crusher to do the Brix refractometer. That's a possibility too for getting plant sap out. And I've got information on Brix use. If you guys want that information as well, you can email me and I'll send it to you so you know how to use it, because those two things in combination are really, really spectacular. So, all right, let's move on to the next slide. So ultimately we're gonna start by digging a hole, and we're gonna dig an 8x8 hole and a square, and you want to go about 12 inches deep. And you want to be able to see, what's happening with the roots. And it's nice if you can get, a decent amount, and it totally depends on the soil, what kind of hole you're going to get. Sometimes they're nice and square and you can see everything really easily. And sometimes they're kind of going to fall in on each other, fall in on itself and that type of thing. But ultimately, if you can, try to keep as much of the soil intact as one kind of cube when you're trying to pull it out of the ground. That doesn't always work, but it does give you an idea of what that soil's like when it's coming out. Don't let it break up, because you can start to see aggregation and different things like that a little bit better when you try to keep it into one spot. We had already gone through this a little bit, and so it had been separated out, but ultimately the more that you can keep it intact, the better. So how many people have dug holes in their gardens and checked some things out? Okay.
What kind of holes?
Any kind of hole with the intention of looking at the soil below. Yeah. So what were some of the discoveries that y'all made when you dug holes? Limestone. Rocks. Okay.
The good dirt was certain amount down, and then below that it was gray or whiter.
Okay. Yeah. Earthworms, nice. That's good. That's a good sign. Anybody else?
Surprising. Shiny side.
A shiny side from where the spade was up against was cutting through. Okay. Yep. Lots of clay. That's can be good. Tree roots. All right. Excellent. So those are all different things that we can see, right? And now I'm going to give you some insight onto what else to look for. So this is just an added thing that you can do to find out your soil texture. We really want our soils to be in that kind of left bottom area, being clay loams and sandy clay loams and sandy loams. Those are considered the most ideal for farming. But you can work with a lot of different things, and you can change soils over time. And so I'm going to give you some instruction now on how you can figure out what your soil texture is by using what we call like a ribbon field test. Has anybody ever done this before? No. Okay. I am going to show y'all.
What was it again?
It's called the soil ribbon test. Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to try to remove some, you know, probably like the top 3 inches of the soil or whatever, where all of the roots lie and the organic matter, hopefully, and things like that. And you get a little bit below to where it's more the mineral content of the soil, the parent material. Parent material is sand, silt, and clay, right? That's what makes up the main textural components of soil. And then when the organic matter and everything mixes into it is when you get topsoil. But when you start going into those lower areas of the soil, you know, 4 or so inches down, you start getting into the mineral content. So you'll kind of dig down to that area, you take the soil in your hand, and you're going to try to form a ball with it. Now, if it's too dry, you add a little water to it and you create that ball in your hand. And then you push it, right? You basically take your thumb and you push against it, and you do these different, if it breaks right away, it usually means that you have a loam, like a medium textured soil. And if you can push it through and you get a little bit of a ribbon, then that's a clay loam. And then if you can just keep pushing it through and it keeps kind of rolling over like that, that's a clay textured soil. And so ultimately that can give you an idea of where you are within your soil texture. And that's important to know, right? Because it's going to tell you what happens if you have more clay in your soil. Does anybody know what happens if you have more clay in your soil?
Less water.
Well, it depends, right? It can become tighter, right? Which can make it less water holding. But what it also does is it's able to bind minerals to it, right? It's a colloid. So all of those minerals are going to bind to it. That's where the term cation exchange capacity, CEC. So if you do a soil test and you have a CEC of 20, that's really high. And that's really good. That usually indicates a lot of fertility, right? And so the more clay you have in your soil, generally the higher your cation exchange capacity is going to be, meaning that there's more minerals available to the plants that you want to grow. But if you have a very sandy soil, you're going to have less clay colloids, and those minerals aren't going to bind as much. So you're going to be leaching nutrients to the soil quite a bit. And you're going to need to be doing different things to your soil in order to amend it to hold that water and nutrients in it, right? So increasing organic matter, right? The organic matter and the clay kind of work together to create like this really nice fertility in the soil. But if you have a more sandy soil and less clay, then you're going to have to mend in certain ways in order to make that work. So this is a ribbon test. You can do this to just kind of get an idea of what's going on in your soil. And I will send these slides out, but you can kind of see this is another example of how you can differentiate between the different types there and get an idea of what you're dealing with there. All right, so let's get into soil structure. So the first thing we want to look at is how many aggregates are in the soil. Does anybody know how aggregates are formed? Nope. Okay, so aggregates are formed by way of the microbes in the soil. So either bacteria or fungi are going to basically create glues, right? They secrete glues. They secrete a thing called glomalin. And glomalin is like a slimy, gooey structure like okra, right? That comes out of the microbe and creates glues that bind the soil together into these either really large aggregates or these smaller aggregates, or if you have no aggregates, you just get basic compaction there, right? So ultimately, when we dig into the ground, we want to see a lot of aggregation. And this is a picture that I took in a pasture in Montana this spring. And so you can see there that there's a nice amount of aggregation happening there, right? You've got small aggregates, you've got a few larger ones, but mostly it's like this nice evenness that's happening through the aggregation there. And so what does that mean can happen when there's that kind of aggregation?
Easy for roots to go through it.
Easy for roots to go through it, right? So they can go into those deeper mineral layers, right, that go down below, and they can start tapping into some of those mineral layers that are a little lower, right? What else can move through when there's aggregation? Water and air, right, which is going to feed the soil. Now, another really interesting thing that happens when you are allowing for enough aggregation to happen is there's nitrogen fixation that happens. So a lot of times we think about nitrogen fixation only happening in in root nodules, right? Like rhizobium that are on legumes or different things like that. But interestingly enough, in these anaerobic spaces that exist between the aggregates, there's free living nitrogen bacteria that basically convert nitrogen as well and make that available to the plant. And so this is something that we're learning more about as time progresses. And it's pretty interesting because more and more we're realizing that if we just let nature do its job, we can allow for more nitrogen to happen in the soil, which is, you know, one of the #1 nutrients that we need for plant growth. So ultimately, we really want to make sure that we've got aggregation going on there. And so the best way to do that is to increase our soil microbiology. So we need to set it up for soil microbiology to develop. So this is just like a closer picture of what it looks like inside of all those aggregates that I just showed you in that picture. So you've got the sand, silt, and clay particles, right? And then you have the tree, the plant root coming down. You've got the root nodule, which is showing there on that upper right hand and on the left hand over here. Those are actually the nitrogen fixers that are happening through the synergy between rhizobia, which is a bacteria that works in symbiosis with the plant and creates nitrogen fixation. But then you have all of these other things that are going on the sidelines, these mites and these nematodes and the organic matter and even human hair and different things like that. And so what's happening with all the microbes is one eats the other. So you have the protists in the soil, and those protists come in and they eat the bacteria, and bacteria are just all nitrogen. Their bodies are just nitrogen. So when they eat all the bacteria, they then poop them out, and then they make basically plants available nitrogen, right? So all of these things are happening. And if we don't have that porosity in the soil structure, we just aren't making nitrogen. We're not making all of these other things that we need. So it's really important to create that soil structure and allow for all of these little nooks and crannies for the housing of all the microbiology that's living in the soil. And so what's really interesting, really fascinating, is there are 10 billion viruses. 10 billion viruses in 1 teaspoon of soil. 10 billion viruses in 1 teaspoon of soil. And we think we know something about viruses. We have a lot to learn, I think, as time progresses. But ultimately, you know, viruses are good. We look at them as bad. We look at bacteria as bad. We look at fungi as bad. We look at fungi as death and decrepit. And we look at, you know, bacteria as things that make us sick. And we look at viruses as things that make us sick. Ultimately, these are things that actually make us healthy. And it's a very, very, very small percentage that make us sick. And so, you know, there's been lots of studies that have shown that kids that grow up on farms in comparison to urban environments have way, way, way better immune systems because of the amount of fecal matter that they're exposed to in their youth. So I'm not saying that we just need to go out and eat a bunch of poop, but we do eat poop pretty regularly, and it can actually make us healthier, right? When we are allowing for the system to be working properly, right? And we're allowing for that airflow, and we're allowing for the water to move through, and we're allowing for all of these things to create a synergy that then creates health in the soil and in our foods as well. All right, so moving on, soil porosity is actually very similar, but ultimately we need to make sure that we have the capacity to move things, and we need to make sure that we don't have anaerobic activity going on. So sulfur and nitrogen can't be converted into plant available forms when there's no soil porosity. When you have compacted soil like this, more than likely they're not going to be getting the sulfur and nitrogen that they need, which is huge because that needs air in order to convert it into the plant available forms. And additionally, what else happens when we have a lack of air is we have greenhouse gases that begin to develop in the soil. And those greenhouse gases contribute to a lot of different things, but you know, ethanol and ethylene and acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, those are all different gases, greenhouse gases that occur when we have compacted soils, because there's just an inability for things to be moved and processed through things. Yes, Tim?
On a pasture that has poor condition,
Mm-hmm.
black clay soil,
Uh-huh.
all right, is it appropriate and you want to graze more animals, so you want grass,
Uh-huh.
right? Would it be appropriate to add sulfur to something?
Yeah, I mean, you can add sulfur to flocculate the soil to a certain extent, right? So there's different things that you can use. I used to really tend to think in terms of amending soil as a good method. At this point, I'm trying to, not everybody has the capacity to use livestock, but if you do have the capacity to use livestock, I would encourage that you go in with really, really high stocking densities and you do like 1 million pounds per acre of animal livestock, right? So your average heifer weighs between 900 to 1,000 pounds, right? And so ultimately, you would then literally, create 1 million pounds of animal weight, and you'd put it, in whatever amount of acreage, depending on how many cattle you had. And you would literally take them into that pasture, and they'd be in there for anywhere from 30 minutes, maybe to 45, depending on the size of the pasture, what you were doing. Their urination, their defecation, their hoof action, and the amount of microbes that were in the soil, along with the nitrogen from their urine and the different minerals that were coming down and the organic matter that was coming in from the dunging, can create pasture change so quickly. It's so quick, especially with cattle dung, because of the moisture that's in it. It's different when you have ruminant, small ruminants, but ultimately that's kind of how I feel about things now, rather than amending. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't amend, because sometimes you just need to, and you can put some, magnesium down, you can put some sulfur, you can put some, lime, different things like that. But there's a lot of things that you can do to amend. If you have really compacted soil, putting down, lime for the calcium flocculates soil. So it expands the capacity for soil to create porosity, and magnesium tightens soil. And so it creates stickiness. And ultimately, we want that soil to have a nice balance of calcium to magnesium. And so sometimes if you have a little bit too much magnesium going on, you can put that lime in and create a little bit of calcium in there. And then that gets the microbes upregulated, because the microbes need calcium in order to come alive again. And so it's all this very intricate, interconnected system. And I'm going in the weeds here, so we're getting pretty deep with some of this stuff. It's very complicated. Yes, sir.
What does sulfur do?
Well, sulfur makes nitrogen available. They work in synergy to one another. So ultimately, you've got to have them together. But it also acts in a lot of ways as a plant. It prevents diseases from bacteria and different things like that. And certain plants need it more than others, depending on what you're growing. Everything does a lot, right? So it's like you can pick apart a few little things of what all of these different minerals do, but they all do a lot of things, just as minerals do in our body, And so it becomes, you could study just what minerals do in the soil for ages, right? But ultimately, we need it to act as in a sense, an antibiotic, just in the right way, and to make nitrogen available. Yeah.
Have you studied compost tea? Because I'm thinking also about the microbes. I would understand that the animals bring a greater diversity based on what they've been eating, how they've been raised.
Yeah.
But is it Elaine Ingham who did the compost tea, the aerobic one? Because I was thinking Betsy Ross used that here locally, and so it is adding something. But if you don't have the livestock to get started, I'm just wondering if you've studied that and how quickly that can turn over. it, you know, when we have a drought like we are with 110 degrees,
Mhm.
what that does
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. I worked for Betsy for
Okay.
quite a while. And so I learned a lot about using the different amendments and things like that. And I definitely think that they can be very, very useful. In the end, Betsy started going down the path of not using a lot of teas because it's so easy for them to become inactive, right? For the microbes to use up their fuel source really quickly. And then you're just kind of putting down like not very active material. And so I really recommend using vermicast a little bit more, just because if you put them into a liquid and then you feed them some molasses and you give them a little bit of humic acid or fulvic acid or something like that, and you stir it up, it will stay active, you know, for a pretty long period of time. Or just using the vermicast just by themselves, right? You're just letting them go out on the pasture without anything. So, I mean, there's so many options out there. There's so many options out there in that capacity. And then adding the trace minerals to the different things. You know, Betsy's used a liquid compost extractor that she had kind of created that like knocked the microbes off of the compost. So she didn't actually even use the compost. So it was a tea of sorts, but it hadn't been bubbled or, you know,
Anaerobic rather than aerobic.
well, aerobic.
Oh, it was aerobic.
Yeah. Well, you can do them both ways.
Right.
There's ways to do it both ways.
Right.
But in general, you do it aerobically because the air is what feeds the beneficial microbes. Yeah.
So I've quartered here and I have cats and dogs.
Mhm.
And they're food.
Yeah.
I'm running around and I'm just doing cover crops in
Uh-huh.
that field area and, but don't have animals to do that part.
Uh-huh.
So would I need to add some some amendments or is this the cover crops?
What are you doing in that pasture or field?
The cover crops?
Yeah.
I
I mean, what's happening there?
Right now it's bees. The
It's bees. Uh-huh.
And millet
Uh-huh.
and some sorghum.
Mhm.
And then I'll rotate that to probably oats and other stuff.
Yeah.
Austrian peas in the fall.
Gotcha. I mean, so using annuals as cover crops can change the soil microbiology in comparison to perennials. So if you can actually cover crop with quickly producing perennial grasses and forbs instead of using annuals, you will be doing better conditioning in the soil. So annual grasses, particularly a lot of annuals that we use, they're not native species. They may not be invasive, but they're coming from other places. So like oats, for instance, you know, we use oats as a cover crop a lot. And it's not very natural for oats to be growing in Texas environments, right? We have a lot of perennial grasses that like Cytodes grama and things like that grow. And they're shorter lived, lower succession plants. And so ultimately, when we put on those annuals as cover crops, what they create is because their roots go into the ground shallower and more fibrous, and less fibrous, they don't excrete as much exudates into the soil. And they generally tend to make soils more bacterial than fungal. And we want soils to be more fungal because they can hold water better, right? Those mycorrhizal fungi in the soil are what create the internet effect in the soil that holds water in the soil. And so if we keep planting with annual species cover crops, we keep our soil bacterial. Does that make sense?
Well, there is the option of eating this.
Yes, and so there's lots of reasons why people choose to do things, right? So in agricultural environments, right? But if you're talking about soil conditioning and you want to change your soil to hold more water and to be able to withstand drought and things like that, you could probably find some perennial species that you could still consume, right? Especially for your bees or whatnot, that could build the soil and condition it, and not necessarily, because you're not harvesting the sorghum, right?
I feed things to chickens.
You feed it to the chickens, yeah. So ultimately, it's just a matter of, you know, what your priorities become as you're doing things. So every system has to be looked at in its own context all the time.
And I've seen that study that, I don't know how recent it is, but I've been seeing people, I think Lisa O'Donnell from the city, from Balcones Canyonland, she shared it. That study that showed planting the natives bring back the microbes.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand, like, is it like an epigenetic thing, like in the soil or something like that? Or how does the microbes, like, do we not know yet, like, what's happening?
I think we know some, you know, we have to think of soil as like just kind of like a bank for a lot of things. So there's seed banks in the soil, and there's microbe banks in the soil, and there's mineral banks in the soil, and there's all of these banks in the soil that are just sitting there waiting for the right circumstance to happen in order to turn them on. And so it's literally like, for instance, going back to Betsy Ross, the amount of mineral and the amount of nutrient we're actually putting on when we go over the pasture in a spray truck is minuscule. It's next to nothing, you know, it's teeny amounts of molybdenum, cobalt, you know, all of these little teeny tiny things. And ultimately it's tickling the system. It's literally like just this little tiny tickle. And so then boom, it turns on. But it's the same thing at any given time. I mean, we've all walked out into a field at one point. Well, maybe not all of us, but you know, people who have spent some time in nature have walked out into a field and you're like, oh my gosh, look, it's covered in Indian blanket overnight, right? And the Indian blanket crowds out every single thing. You will have no grasses underneath it. It will be completely bare ground underneath. And it will do that for 2 years. And then the third year, you don't have any more. It's done, right? And so there's that concept of what are weeds telling us? How do we observe land? And how do we take in all the little things and think about it from like the bigger scheme of things, right? And what is that doing? So more than likely, it has a taproot that's tapping into deeper layers of the soil, pulling up those minerals that reside deeper in the soil and making them available to the topsoil. And then 2 years later, that goes away. And ultimately, you then start developing some higher succession grasses as things move forward. But it's just kind of like an explosion, right? And just since we brought up Betsy Ross, and bless her heart, I miss her, you know, she said, you know, Mama Nature, she leaves a place at the table for everybody. You know, nothing's a mistake, even those wild hogs, you know, like, I mean, you know, it's like everything is doing a job. Everything's building on top of the next, you know, for one reason or another. And so ultimately, you just have to kind of take your vision much broader and do bigger observations and start looking at things, you know, learning ecology on the grander scales to understand why those things might be happening, you know. Okay, so porosity. This is going to be a long presentation. We don't have to go through it all. So ultimately here, all those little microbes that we were talking about just now, that's just how it's working. And it's not just below ground, but it's above ground, right? Your birds and your little animals, your arthropods, all of those things feed on one another to create those different cycles of nutrients in the soil. Okay, so let's get to modeling. So modeling is when you see little rust spots or gray colored spots in the soil when you dig a hole. And why do you think you see gray spots? Yes.
Lack of organic matter.
Well, that could be one reason, because if you had some organic matter in there, it would probably make the soil be different. But models occur when soil goes anaerobic, okay? And so we have little flecks of iron and molybdenum, manganese in the soil. And those little flecks, they're metals, right? And so when they stay wet for an extended period of time, they will turn from orange to gray, right? And if you have enough organic matter in the soil, you're probably not going to see as many of those flecks, right? Because that organic matter is going to mix in, and you're not going to get those, you know, those like big chunks of metals all in one place, because those nutrients are going to be cycling more, right? Through, by way of that organic matter and by way of roots being able to come down into it. And so ultimately what happens is when you start to have anaerobic conditions in the soil, and that can be because your water table is very, you know, it's very high and it comes up into your garden, and it's, you know, coming up when it rains and staying up for an extended period of time and keeping things anaerobic. And you have to remember that if that's happening in your garden, or maybe you have a serious limestone pan, right? A caliche pan below the soil surface, and it just doesn't allow much water to penetrate. And so that water is staying in the soil. It's creating an anaerobic condition, and it's creating that mottling with that iron and manganese in there. And so what that means is, what happens when you're underwater for a long period of time? You suffocate. So the roots suffocate in an anaerobic soil as well. So ultimately, if you're seeing mottling in your soil and you're digging in and you're seeing these colors, especially the gray colors, it means that it's really anaerobic. So if you're seeing some of the orange colors, it means that on occasion there's probably some water stagnation and anaerobicness going on. But if you see, you know, a nice even keel mixture, then more than likely you're not having a lot of that going on. So looking for mottling is also really important. And basically those models are just created by oxidation, and they usually turn from brown and orange to like the middle one, and they go to that gray color after more anaerobic activity occurs there. Okay, so soil color is the other thing that we want to look for. And this is where digging under the fence can be really, really helpful, because digging under the fence is usually where you'll see a lot of organic matter, and you'll see it in its most natural form, right? Because it's undisturbed and uncompacted. And so ultimately, if you have a compacted soil over here, you might see like a really dark layer on top, but nothing is going down the horizon, the soil horizons. In this middle section, you know, you see a little bit of that brownness coming through. And over here, you see the darkness kind of all the way throughout. And so we want to make sure that there's color in the soil, and that that topsoil has the capacity to kind of slowly be moved down the soil horizon and integrate so that it can attach to those clay colloids and make the minerals more available. Soil organic matter feeds microbes, right? It's the carbon source that feeds microbes, because it needs those carbon sources in order to balance out the nitrogen that it's using, that it needs to, it basically, there's nitrogen in the soil, and it needs that soil organic matter in order to process both of those things together and make them plant available. And so ultimately, your nitrogen to carbon ratio is really important. And if you don't have a lot of soil organic matter, you're just not going to have that nutrient cycling in the same capacity. If you have too much carbon and not enough nitrogen, or too much nitrogen and not enough carbon, your microbes can senesce or become really active, or senesce and become really active. And so kind of creating that perfect ratio is also really important there. All right, and here's your worms. So worms are really important, and I love to read this particular thing. So compared to undigested soil, earthworm casts can contain 5 times as much plant available nitrogen, 3 to 7 times as much phosphorus, and 11 times as much potassium, and 3 times as much magnesium. Dead earthworms contribute significant amount of nitrogen to the soil, being 60 to 70% protein in dry weight, with a nitrogen content of 12%. So we want to see 15 to 45 worms in our little 8x8, 12 inches deep thing that we pull out. I have never seen that in Texas. I mean, you might see it in certain places where you've done lots of soil conditioning. Tim, have you ever done any earthworm counts?
On trenches, yes,
Yeah,
but, you know, it's finding what I call the earth movers, the big foot and a half.
the big
long
ones. Yeah, yeah. It's
Those-
harder. It's harder. You'll see some of the smaller ones like these here, you know, on the right. And that's pretty common to see those. And that's great. I mean, that's still, I've never seen a big one except in my compost piles, you know. But the other thing to look for is on the left-hand side, this is another picture that I took in that pasture in Montana this summer, is those are the larvae of earthworm eggs. So if you see those little gelatinous balls there, those are a good sign for earthworms as well. And there's different colored eggs for the different types of worms, and you can look that up. I haven't gotten that, you know, technical with it. But ultimately, you know, the worms are moving through, they're creating holes through the soil that then can move nutrients. They are placing on top of the soil their castings, which are just chock full of minerals and nitrogen and all of those different things like that. So really, really important to get these. And if you don't have earthworms, you know, you can apply earthworm castings, which can call to it more worms, actually. And the other thing that's very interesting about earthworm castings is that there's a lot of protist in them, and there actually is, they tend to increase good nematodes as well. And so ultimately we want to have as many worms as possible, but we often lack protist in our soils. Our soils are often really, really highly bacterial, and there's not a lot of protist, which eat the bacteria and make that nitrogen available. So the more that we can get the protist, the better, and earthworm castings have a lot of those in there.
Would you say again the number of earthworms that you would like to have between 15 and?
And 45. I mean, there could be more than that, but yeah, yeah. But again, I don't know. I've never seen that. So, yes, sir.
How did you get that picture of like a piece of glass there and the earthworm right on the piece of glass?
I found that picture online. But yeah, I think that there are people, you know, I have seen some that they just have the whole thing going and it's just glass, and, you know, somehow they make it happen that way. But yeah, I always wonder that too. All right, so soil smell. How many people smell their soil? It's good, right? Yeah, it's yummy. Some people like to eat it. Pregnant women. Yeah, yeah. It's a thing. It's a thing. I know some people too.
Is it like a low iron thing? I've heard like people with pica. You know, that
Yeah,
sugar.
yeah. I think that there's definitely mineral deficiencies involved in that, but I also think it's just such a primordial thing as well. So for instance, geosmin is one of the things that makes the smell in soil, and that's caused by the streptomyces bacteria in the soil. And so we are 100 trillion, we can detect the smell of geosmin 100 parts per trillion, which is something like 3 times as more sensitive than sharks to blood and water. So that's like pretty profound, right? There's a reason why we are supposed to be this sensitive to the smells that come from soil. And because we are soil, like we're from, you know, we're from the soil. We're all cycling through these cosmos and planets and all of these things, you know, like it's all this matter, right? Cycling. So ultimately, I think that that's why we're so sensitive to it. But in general, when we're looking at soil smell, there's some main things that we want to look at here. And we want to mostly be smelling like a rich, earthy, sweet, kind of wholesome, fresh smell. Like when you walk into the redwood forests, right? It just smells so wonderful. And that's that very, very fungal soil that we're smelling, right? Then when you have a little bit more bacterial soil, you're going to have still earthy and sweet, but it's going to have a little bit more of that minerally smell. It won't be quite as just sweet. It's going to be a little tinge, more like astringent is how I like to, I don't know if you can smell astringency, but that's how I think of it. And then if you're smelling like a putrid, sour, or chemical smell, that usually means that it's gone anaerobic and that there's just not enough moisture going on. So smelling and trying to figure out, what's happening there is another really good way to tell whether soil is healthy. Now, if you can't smell it when you try to, pour some water on it, and the water usually will wake up that smell, and you can get a better idea of what's going on there. Okay, so root depth. How many people in Texas have roots that look like this? So it can be hard to have really deep roots here, but just because we live on a limestone shelf. But what we really want to be looking at is when we dig, one of the things to think about is the sound that your shovel makes as it's going into the ground. Do you hear roots popping as it goes through? Or is it just kind of the sound of soil? That can be a really big indicator. We want the roots to be going all the way down. If you see roots kind of just taking a quick side angle and they're just all growing that way, it means that they've hit a hard pan, right? And so they're just only tapping into a certain amount of nutrients in the soil. And ultimately they need to go deeper to get what they need to grow. So they're only going to grow so high when there's that hard pan there. And so you also want to look and see, are they fibrous? Are they able to easily move through the soil? Do you find really thick roots in some places? It's like they're still getting through the soil, but they've had to grow and create larger roots in order to make it through that. Or are they kind of fine and fibrous and easily moving through the soil? So those are all things to look at there. But how deep does it go down? And that type of thing is very important. And when these roots senesce, they turn into organic matter, right? And they increase that water storage, water holding capacity in the soil as well. So the deeper that our roots can go, generally the better our available water holding capacity is as well with root depth. And then when you're looking at the roots, if you can break it apart and see if you see root nodules, you're only going to see those in legume plants, right? So peas and alfalfa and vetch and different things like that. And this nodule is the interaction of the plant with a bacteria called rhizobia. And that bacteria is a nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so it fixes nitrogen in those nodules. If you cut open the nodule and it's pink, it means that it's fixing nitrogen. If you cut it open and it's green, it means it was fixing nitrogen, but it stopped fixing nitrogen. And if they are white inside, it means that they're not fixing nitrogen at all, and they never have been. And that means probably that there's not enough of cobalt and molybdenum in the soil to make that nitrogen fixation go on. And so it's really important if you're looking at your nodulation to cut them open and see what you've got going on there. Because you may have the nodules, but they're not doing anything. And you can then put some different things into the soil, more organic matter or different nutrients, and increase that nodulation from happening and more nitrogen fixation in the soil. So soil compaction, we definitely want to prevent this as much as possible. It's very challenging to do that. There's a lot of compaction that happens as we tread across our gardens, as we bring livestock onto the land, as we drive across the land, and just as our plants turn from invasives to from perennials, right? These things are just happening. And so ultimately we need to look for those hard pans. Now, if you can dig a bigger hole and you can actually, get to where you might find a couple of different hard pans by taking your knife and just cutting straight down, and your knife should go in through, and then you'll hit a spot that just becomes hard, and you have to kind of like hopefully move your knife through it. It might not go through it. You can see where those hard pans are. And sometimes they can be very close to the surface, and you could do a little subsoil ripping in your garden, and you could break up that hard pan and probably get things moving a little bit more. So you can consider that. The nitrogen cycle gets disrupted when there's a lack of movement, and when compaction is not available, when those microbes can't feed on each other, and the soil generally tends to go bacterial with compaction. So that nitrogen cycle gets broken down. And then a couple of last slides here. One of the things to look for is surface ponding. So after it rains, when you walk out into your garden, how long does the water sit on top of the soil surface? If it's, one day following heavy rain, everything's absorbed and you're good, then you're probably doing really well. If you still have some ponding and it's continuing after 1 day and staying for 3 to 5 days, you've probably got some compaction going on. And then when it's lasting for longer than that, I'd say you probably have deep compaction and anaerobic soils and things of that sort. And those are the things that you want to avoid. So after it rains, go out and look at your soils. And then surface relief, again, soils should be able to withstand treading if they're healthy, and they shouldn't become, mucky and compacted, right? If they have good mycorrhizal fungi in there, they should be spongy. And so ultimately, surface relief can tell you a lot about the microbiology in your soil. And in general, even if you have a rain event where things do get pocked and pugged, if you have good soil microbiology, a lot of times that surface area will level out pretty quickly. It won't last for too long. You might get a little bit of that, but then it's going to improve. Whereas if it stays like that, it probably means that you have a lot of compaction or stickiness or things going on that aren't working in that soil. So what can we do? We can practice these 6 principles of regenerative agriculture. So the first one is context, and this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. With each operation has its own needs based on what you're trying to do with the land, what kind of money you're trying to make, and what kind of social context you want to create with your land and things like that. So in general, the context is where you are and the place that you are, but it's the social, the financial, and the ecological context as well. And then we want to minimize soil disturbance. So that's chemical, that's chemical, physical, and biological. And then maximize crop diversity. So rotate your crops, always do things differently, create disorder, create disruption regularly. Nature is always creating disruption. And if we do the same things over and over, the same all the time, just like with your husband or wife, you get really tired of it. So, I mean, maybe not, but sometimes you're like, oh my God, why are you doing that again? And the garden feels the same. So in general, we also want to keep the soil covered and making sure that there's a continuous living plant root in the ground at all times. And then if you have the capacity to integrate livestock, do it. It's not absolutely necessary, but it can be helpful. You can always get a little herd of goats to come on and clean out some moribund plant material from certain areas on occasion if you fancy that. But ultimately, these are the ways that we can improve things. And we can compost and add organic matter and do a lot of different things. But in general, if we follow these 6 principles, we're going to wind up doing better than, that's kind of the beginning, the basis of it all to live by. So that is the end of the presentation. And hopefully y'all can all go and dig a hole in your soil and look at some of these things and feel like, oh my gosh, actually I am seeing some of this, or I'm not seeing some of it. And it really is a profound thing. And don't underestimate yourself. You might think, oh, I'm not going to know what to look for after just this one little presentation. It's very intuitive, and you actually do. And you need to trust yourself, because we have this in us, all of us, to kind of use our senses and our observation. And we've become so detached from our capacity to be intuitive that sometimes we forget how powerful we are. And this is a really awesome, simple way to do that. So I will take questions. Thank you.
Yeah. A couple things. What are your thoughts about no-till gardening? I know what you do is vast,
Mhm.
and I get all that, but I just know we've got to do something different
Mhm.
in our soils.
Yeah.
I mean, Kansas, Nebraska, they're all really suffering.
Yeah.
Colorado. So that's one thing about the no-till. And then the other comment I would just like to make is, I read a book about earthworms called The Earth Moved.
Uh-huh.
And from what I understand, it's been several years, but the United States did not have earthworms after the last ice age. We brought them in from, Europe, and
Right.
even in far north Minnesota, there are no earthworms up in the forest. And when the earthworms are moving in, now all the duff and the layer is falling because the earthworms are going in and moving
Eating it.
all. So again, it's really changing what has been there, whether that's good or bad. I love the earthworms, but again, there is a cost.
Absolutely. There's a cost with everything. Absolutely. So just to start with your first thing, what do I think about no-till? I think it's all we should be doing. I do not think we should be tilling. I mean, you know, maybe there's certain areas where you till in strips or certain things like that, but by no means do I think we should be tilling whole fields and leaving them fallow and, you know, raising temperatures and putting gases out into the atmosphere. So, and it is hard to do no-till farming. Try to do some no-till farming in South Texas. It doesn't freeze and the weeds are insane, and growing cover crops is hard, and finding the right species. I mean, it is hard. It's not lost on me that all of this is very, very intense and costly. And I understand why people keep doing things the way they're doing them, because they know it and because it's working for them to a certain extent for the time being. But ultimately, you know, we've got to make some bigger decisions on how we're going to move forward. And luckily there's some, you know, extremely awesome, innovative people out there, you know, doing some really cool things to create easier ways to do no-till farming. Yeah. And as far as the worms, you know, I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, the worms are here and I'm glad they're here, and yes, everything has an effect. Yeah. Yes.
If you were going to do one thing, you've seen so many ways to do this, but if you were just like, I only have the bandwidth to do one thing, what would you do?
In what environment?
I guess let's just say backyard gardening.
A backyard garden. Okay. So I think the biggest thing would be to try not to tread on your garden very much. Like try to not compact your garden. And so I think one of the best ways to do that is to create like wood chip pathways, because those wood chips do, you know, break down, and then you can till that into the soil around, even if you don't do it like Tim's doing it, but you know, just keep some pathways where that's happening, but you're building soil underneath it. And then you can maybe every 2 years, like switch them back and forth, right? Where you're walking and then you've built up organic matter and nutrients in the soil. So I think that's probably one of the main things that I could say is just watch soil compaction. By adding those wood chips, you can really decrease that from happening. You know, there is the concept that, oh, well, you can put too much carbon in and then that can steal nitrogen from your plants and things like that. And that does happen in some environments. It can happen. So you just have to play with it a little bit. But yeah, adding organic matter. And I really like organic matter added by wood chips. Yeah.
So we've been doing in the gardens, in the teaching gardens here, we'll do wood chips and the pathways.
Yeah.
And mix in the mushroom blocks.
Yeah.
So that
Oh,
breaks it
awesome.
down even faster.
That's awesome.
So you're kind of getting like a double.
Yeah. Double whammy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can like get those mushroom blocks and put them in your compost piles too. You know, just break them up in your compost piles and add coffee grounds and do like little layers, and it will make your compost break down quicker too. I guess, you know, you just have to get acquainted with your local mushroom grower.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
We had a speaker who came out, talked about pigeon peas
Mhm.
in South Texas.
Yeah.
And
Justin.
yeah.
Yeah.
And he was like anti-grass.
Yeah.
I was like, what? So I'm trying to think of a way you could integrate some perennial things with some annual things.
Yeah.
Is that like maybe intercrop it, or what do we do with that?
You could certainly grow grasses with the peas. I mean,
And they do.
that would work just
Yeah.
fine. And actually, when you look at what it does in the soil, like I had this colleague who, by y'all, thank you. I had a colleague who did, you know, grasses in one year And he was doing massive, huge, organic farming down in Mexico, like, hundreds of thousands of acres. And they would do crop rotations between like corn and tomatoes or something, but until they would do 1 year with grass in between, they were realizing that even if they weren't planting a crop for that 1 year, but they put grasses in the ground, their yields the following years were just like, they were making more money from actually putting land fallow. I mean, not putting land in grass that didn't produce a product, but it was conditioning the soil to such an extent that they were actually increasing their revenue.
Those grasses are hard, some of them are brittle.
Yeah.
And so you try to plant intercrop with them and they're real thick and
Yeah.
that rye or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it's a real challenge to work with.
Yeah.
Those kinds of grasses that are perennial because they're not friendly to.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, like I said, I'm not a farmer, so it's not in my wheelhouse as much to be able to answer off, real quickly for which grasses are the best to like no-till plants into. But the One Straw Revolution talks quite a bit about that.
Oh, that's
Yeah, he does talk about that. So.
And that was a question on Zoom as well, like what are the plants, what are the cover crops that are perennials?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So here in Texas, in the central Texas area, green spangletop, side oats, grama, hairy grama, buffalo grass, that can take a while. Blue stem, little blue stem, those will germinate pretty quickly. But the side oats grama and the green spangletop are the two perennials that are going to be the first to come up in those like lower succession perennial grass species. I think it's Texas grama.
There's a Texas bluegrass.
Yeah.
Have a different.
Okay.
Trying to figure that one out.
Yeah.
Know about that?
I mean, it's hard because the common names are, a little different everywhere. Like people call things different things. So it's like what exactly it is that you're talking about, I'm not positive, but yeah. Yes.
You mentioned coffee grounds. How about tea leaves?
Yeah, I'm sure you could use tea leaves. I know that coffee is considered green in a compost because of the nitrogen content. I don't know whether tea would be considered a green or brown material. Do you?
No, the reason I'm asking is, the reason I'm here is I have a few plants and I brought them in for winter and they all died. And so I wanted to learn about soil and
Gotcha.
but
Yeah.
I put tea leaves. I didn't put coffee grounds. I put tea leaves. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to see what I did wrong.
Well, tea leaves they're tannic, right? There's a lot of tannins in them. I don't know if that could have been a problem. I mean, there's tannins and lots of different things, but yeah, I don't know if it could have been too acidic, but I would just get some earthworm castings and just put them in your plants,
What did you say?
earthworm castings.
Casting.
The castings, yeah, you can buy the casting. There's a Texas Worm Ranch, is that what it's called? Texas Worm something, but it's nice to buy from a local environment where they're growing at least somewhat. I think they're in Dallas, so but
You can have a worm bin.
and you can have a worm bin. You can make your own worm bin. Yeah, very easy to do. But putting those just dried earthworm, they're dry, and then you just either soak your water and put them in there. Sometimes I'll put them in some water and add a little molasses to it just to give them some food and then pour it into the plant. But usually just putting the castings on your plant. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question on grasshoppers.
Mm-hmm.
The big plague that was like from Del Valley all the way up to Taylor.
Uh-huh.
All right, and they were eating the Johnson grass and just about everything else. Were the sugars being released more on the Johnson grass, and that's why the grasshoppers ate it right down to the ground, or were there just so many grasshoppers?
What's interesting is that usually plants that attract insects like that are really, really low in sugars and they're really high in nitrates. So their Brix levels are incredibly low, and those nitrates send out a smell that attracts the insects. A healthy plant, you know, that's what they say, right? They're always talking about how if you grow organic and you have healthy plants, you're not going to, you know, attract bugs. I don't believe that, but it might be better. It might be better, but anyway, but when you have these really intense outbreaks, right? It's that the nitrates come up in the plant and it just sends out a smell that it's just an you know, it's not energy, it's actually a smell that the insects can smell. And they go to that because when Brix levels are high in a plant, the insect's GI tract isn't even able to digest the high sugars and things like that that are in a healthy plant. And so they have to go for the weakened plants with the lower Brix levels. So now when you have a plague and stuff like that, where they're just coming through at such ferocity, you know, I really don't know for sure whether you're just getting that much of a nitrate level in a huge swath. Probably not. You know, there's probably something going on that's allowing that to get out of control and then move through. So I don't know the answer to your question.
People lost fruit trees.
Yeah.
Ate all the leaves, ate the bark off.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, yes, yes.
We had 3 great big grasshoppers.
I went off that direction just to drive. You know, I always like to just drive around and see other farms. Yeah, oh yeah. You're using your windshield wiper to get through clouds at times. Yes. And some of that is conducive because grasshoppers lay their eggs in bare soil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So farm fields are vacant.
Right.
Because of poor, I mean, not necessarily poor farming practices, but the crop has been harvested.
Right.
Also the development all up in that area has taken out farm fields and harbor the grasshoppers in these backyard gardens. And then they move off into the field and come back in for the daytime.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, yes, it was devastating. Still, I don't
it's terrible.
Questions and answerings that are sent to me. I was like, well, it's like,
yeah.
So it's just in certain areas.
Well, I would say that area stretched for about 70 miles. Now, we have a big wind change, so I think some of that wind change blew them further east and south. We have a storm front that came about a week ago, and so that dissipated a whole bunch of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I really haven't studied insects very much. It's, you know, a missing gap in my knowledge because there's a lot to it and they can tell you a lot, you know, that the insects that show up will tell you a lot. The weeds that show up will tell you a lot, you know, all of that will tell you a lot, but I just haven't studied that very much. So.
Do you have contact info for people to ask you questions?
Yes. Yeah, I've been answering some of them. I put the link to the recording in the chat. So anybody here, if you want to catch up, you know, the recording will be on our YouTube channel.
Sweet. Lovely.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
I had one kind of last question, like this kind of gets into the microbes in the soil. So we were just talking about kind of the stress response. And I'm currently working on a project that has to do with endophytes.
Okay.
And I'm just curious about your knowledge, because I know it's like one of the areas of like the fungal microbial community that we know so little about. And since you know so much, what do you know about endophytes and how they interact to kind of help plants do that communication and sort of, you know, the way I hear them described, they're sort of like the microbiome of the plant. But I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah, well, now, are you talking about like with fescue grass, or are you talking about?
Just with all plants, because every
With all
plant
plants.
that's been studied today
Yeah.
has like endophytes.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
they're like considered microbial and also fungal.
Yeah, I mean, they move into the plant and basically create their habitat.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would be making something up right now if I told you something. I've learned about them and I'm just not pulling it out of my head right now, but I do have quite a bit of information on them from the program that I just did with Nicole Masters. We have like lots of information. So I will try to remember, if you email me, I will give you what I've got.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's some, I think my brain just kind of like shut down all of it. I'm like, I don't know, endophytes, don't ask me, I don't know. But yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, yes.
You just go to ranches and help people, is that your job this week?
I do, yeah. I work a lot with grazers and helping them to just try to improve their grazing practices and that type of thing, so, yes.
So I have an easy question, and if you want, this will be, but I have, right now, I'm not able to maintain living plant carpet on my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
We do rainwater collection, we are running out of water.
Mm-hmm.
I just snip the plants off the dirt, and so what can I do?
To grow plants or,
Well, to like, 'cause I don't have water, so
Uh-huh.
it's not raining.
yeah.